They say, use the right tool for the job, but for some, that's just a suggestion. Today, we're honoring the backyard engineers who looked at a loaded gun and saw a hammer, or saw a seatbelt and thought, bottle opener. These aren't accidents. They're masterpieces of improvisation that ended in closed caskets. Warning: do not attempt this level of stupidity at home. Physics is not your friend. 1. The suburbs of Ohio are usually a sanctuary for manicured lawns, white picket fences, and the gentle hum of normalcy, but on one particularly fateful Saturday, they became the testing ground for a physics experiment that nobody asked for and absolutely nobody survived. Enter Arthur, a man whose enthusiasm for do-it-yourself projects was inversely proportional to his actual understanding of mechanical engineering. Arthur had a problem that plagues many homeowners: a row of overgrown, woody ornamental bushes in his backyard that had mutated from decorative shrubbery into a dense, impenetrable fortress of cellulose. Now, the correct tool for this job is a chainsaw, or perhaps a hedge trimmer, or maybe even just hiring a teenager with a strong back. But Arthur viewed hiring professionals as a personal defeat, and he viewed safety manuals as bureaucratic propaganda designed to slow down men of action. He went to his tool shed and bypassed the manual saws, looking for something with more horsepower and less effort. His eyes landed on his 4.5-inch angle grinder. For the uninitiated, an angle grinder is a tool designed to spin an abrasive disc at a terrifying 11,000 revolutions per minute to grind down solid steel. It is a screaming, spark-throwing demon of a tool. But Arthur had a vision. He had purchased a terrifying aftermarket attachment he found on the darkest corners of the internet. A circular saw blade with chainsaw teeth, specifically sized to fit onto a grinder. This attachment is essentially a circular death sentence that safety organizations have classified as uncontrollable. Because the blade was slightly larger than the grinder's standard housing, Arthur performed the first fatal step of his ritual. He unscrewed and removed the metal safety guard. This is the equivalent of removing the seatbelts from a car because they wrinkle your shirt. He plugged the machine in, and it screamed to life with a pitch that would make a banshee wince. Unlike a chainsaw, which has a clutch and spins at a manageable speed with high torque, a grinder has zero clutch and spins at a speed that turns the blade into a gyroscope of destruction. Arthur approached the bushes with the swagger of a gladiator, completely ignoring the fundamental laws of rotational inertia and kickback. He didn't just trim the edges. He shoved the spinning, toothed steel directly into the thick, hardwood trunk of the largest bush. Here is where the physics lesson began. When a chainsaw hits wood, the chain slides over the surface until it bites. When a grinder blade spinning at 11,000 RPM hits solid wood, it doesn't cut, it grabs. The teeth bit into the wood grain instantly, causing the blade to stop dead. But the motor, spinning with the force of an angry god, did not stop. All that rotational energy had to go somewhere, and since the blade couldn't spin forward, the tool itself launched backward. It's called reactive force, but Arthur probably just called it "oh shati." The grinder kicked back with the violence of a gunshot, ripping out of Arthur's sweaty, ungloved grip. Because he had removed the safety guard, the one thing designed to prevent exactly this scenario, there was nothing between the spinning serrated steel and his own anatomy. The blade, still screaming at full RPM, swung upward in a perfect tragic arc and embedded itself directly into his neck. It was over before his brain could even process the kickback. Arthur collapsed into his overgrown hedges, defeated not by the vegetation, but by his own refusal to use the right tool for the job. He was found later by his wife, the grinder still buzzing in the grass, a grim reminder that when you try to hack physics, physics hacks back. 2. Let's travel to a domestic kitchen in Michigan, a room usually reserved for baking cookies and reheating lasagna, but which was about to become the site of an improvised explosive event that would baffle the local fire marshal. Meet Steve, a backyard mechanic with grease under his fingernails and a hole in his head where his common sense used to be. Steve had spent the entire weekend tearing down the engine of his beloved 1995 Camaro. He was left with a workbench full of pistons, valves, and oil pans, all caked in 20 years of baked-on sludge and road grime. Steve hated scrubbing. He viewed manual cleaning as a failure of imagination. He looked at the pile of dirty metal, then looked at the stainless steel dishwasher built into his kitchen island, and his brain made a connection that should have triggered a biological emergency shutdown. It's a washing machine, he reasoned to his empty house, so why can't it wash car parts? But Steve knew that Cascade pods and hot water wouldn't touch that heavy industrial grease. He needed a solvent. And what is the best solvent in a redneck's arsenal? Gasoline. Steve carried the heavy, oil-slicked car parts into the kitchen and loaded them onto the racks, nestling a crankshaft right next to the coffee mugs. Then, in a move that guaranteed his removal from the gene pool, he poured 2 full gallons of high-octane gasoline directly into the bottom of the dishwasher tub. He closed the door, selected the heavy-duty cycle, and, crucially, hit the button for heated dry. He then walked into the living room, cracked a beer, and turned on the football game, feeling like the Elon Musk of home cleaning. Now, let's look at the chemistry of what happened next inside that sealed metal box. The wash cycle began, spraying hot water around the chamber. This hot water agitated the gasoline, raising its temperature and causing it to vaporize rapidly. Within minutes, the airtight interior of the dishwasher was no longer filled with soapy water. It was filled with a super-concentrated, stoichiometric mixture of gasoline vapor and oxygen. It was effectively a fuel air bomb waiting for a spark. And the dishwasher, helpful appliance that it is, was programmed to provide exactly that. As the wash cycle ended and the heated dry cycle began, the large exposed electric heating element at the bottom of the tub turned on. This coil, designed to glow red-hot to evaporate water droplets, was now submerged in a dense cloud of explosive gas. The reaction was instantaneous and energetic. The spark ignited the vapor, and the pressure inside the machine went from 0 to catastrophic in a microsecond. The explosion didn't just pop the door latch, it obliterated the appliance. The blast wave blew the heavy door of the dishwasher off its hinges and sent it flying through the kitchen island, through the drywall, and into the refrigerator on the opposite wall. The concussion lifted the roof of the single-story house 3 inches off its foundation and blew out every window in the cul-de-sac. Steve never even saw the touchdown he was waiting for. The force of the blast, originating from the center of the house, collapsed the kitchen wall directly onto the sofa where he was sitting. He wanted a clean engine, and he technically got it, by vaporizing it, along with his kitchen, his home, and his life, in a fireball that could be seen from the next county. 3. The open highways of West Texas are a place of freedom, stunning vistas, and occasionally, vehicles that are held together by nothing more than rust and bad intentions. This brings us to Brody, a man whose philosophy on vehicle maintenance was less fix it right and more fix it right now with whatever is in my pocket. Brody was driving his rusted-out 1988 sedan down Interstate 10 at a brisk 75 miles per hour when he encountered a slight mechanical hiccup. His steering wheel broke off. Now, to be fair, the steering column had been wobbling for months, screaming for attention like a neglected toddler, but Brody had just turned up the radio. When the wheel finally sheared off the column, leaving him holding a useless circle of plastic, most people would have panicked, gently braked, and coasted to a stop. Brody, however, saw this as an engineering challenge. He dug into his center console and produced his favorite tool, a pair of rusty, well-used vice grip locking pliers. He looked at the bare, hexagonal steel splines of the steering shaft sticking out of the dashboard and thought, "I got this." He clamped the pliers onto the nub of the shaft, cranked the locking screw down as hard as his grip could manage, and snapped them shut. Voila! He now had a steering tiller. A smarter man would have used this temporary solution to limp the car to the shoulder. Brody, emboldened by his own genius, merged back into the fast lane. It works fine, he probably told himself, ignoring the fact that he was steering a 2-ton death machine with a 6-inch pair of pliers designed for holding pipes, not navigating traffic. For 20 miles, physics turned a blind eye. The friction held. But here is the problem with steering shafts. They are made of hardened, heat-treated steel to prevent them from snapping. Vice grip teeth are also made of hardened steel. When you clamp hardened steel onto hardened steel without cutting into the metal, you are relying entirely on surface friction. As Brody approached a sharp curve in the highway, He needed to apply significant torque to turn the wheels against the resistance of the road and the car's momentum. He yanked the pliers to the left. The car began to turn, but the resistance from the tires was greater than the grip of the pliers. With a sickening metallic scree, the teeth of the pliers slipped. Brody's hand jerked a full 90 degrees to the left, but the steering shaft didn't move an inch. The car, receiving no input to turn, continued on its original vector, straight ahead. In a panic, Brody tried to reclamp the tool, flailing at the dashboard like a man trying to tune a radio during an earthquake. But at 75 miles per hour, you don't get second chances. The sedan drifted across the rumble strips, shot off the shoulder, and launched into the desert scrub. Without any steering control to correct the slide, the car hit a drainage ditch sideways and began to roll. It tumbled end over end for 100 yards before coming to rest as a crumpled heap of scrap metal. Police later found Brody in the driver's seat, the vice grips still sitting on the floor mat where they had fallen. A tragic testament to the fact that while ingenuity is a virtue, using a hand tool to drive a highway missile is just a really complicated way to commit suicide. 4. In the high-stakes world of budget-friendly adrenaline seeking, there is a fine line between being thrifty and being biologically redundant, and Kyle was about to sprint across that line on a piece of webbing he bought at a discount hardware store. Kyle was an aspiring slackliner, a sport that involves balancing on a bouncy, flat rope suspended between two trees. Now, professional slacklines are engineered pieces of equipment designed with dynamic elasticity to absorb the shock of a grown man jumping on them like a gibbon on espresso. They cost about $80. Kyle, however, was a man who viewed price tags as personal challenges. He looked at the professional gear, scoffed, and drove straight to the cargo control aisle of his local depot. There, he found his champion, a heavy-duty, industrial ratchet strap. It was yellow, it was rugged, and most importantly, it was $12. Kyle reasoned that if this strap could hold a pallet of bricks onto a flatbed truck doing 70 on the highway, it could certainly hold him. This is a classic example of false equivalence, a logical fallacy that kills more people than sharks and lightning combined. What Kyle failed to understand was the difference between static load and dynamic load. A cargo strap is designed to hold heavy things still. It has zero stretch. It has zero give. When you jump on it, the energy doesn't dissipate into the weave. It concentrates entirely on the weakest point of the mechanical system. Kyle took his yellow strap of doom into the woods and found two sturdy oaks. He wrapped the ends, hooked the metal ratchet mechanism together, and began to crank. He wanted it tight. He wanted it to sing like a guitar string. He cranked the heavy steel handle until the strap was vibrating with tension, storing an immense amount of potential energy within the woven polyester fibers. The ratchet mechanism, a chunk of steel weighing about 2 pounds, was now under thousands of pounds of tension, held in place by a tiny metal pawl and a single bolt. Kyle stepped onto the line. It held. Emboldened, he began to bounce. He wanted to get some air. He jumped up, and as he came down, his entire body weight, multiplied by the acceleration of gravity, hit that unforgiving, non-stretchy strap. The force transferred instantly to the ratchet. The metal assembly, which was never designed for this kind of shock, essentially disintegrated. The locking pin sheared off with a sound like a gunshot. Now, here is the physics lesson Kyle missed in high school. When a strap under extreme tension snaps, the heavy metal buckle doesn't just fall to the ground. It follows the path of least resistance, which in this case was a direct, supersonic recoil back toward the center of the line where the weight had just been applied. The heavy steel ratchet became a projectile traveling at roughly the speed of a fastball, but with jagged edges. It struck Kyle directly in the temple before his feet even touched the ground. He had successfully saved $68 on equipment, a savings he would unfortunately never get to spend, proving once and for all that while you can discount the gear, you can never discount the laws of physics. 5. If you have ever looked at a car's suspension system and thought, I can fix that with some office supplies, you might be spiritually related to our next protagonist, a backyard mechanic named Derek. Derek was a man who believed that specialty tools were a scam invented by Big Automotive to steal money from honest, hard-working DIY enthusiasts. His project for the afternoon was replacing the struts on his aging sedan, a job that requires compressing the massive, heavy-duty coil springs that hold the car up. Now, a car spring is essentially a coiled-up metal bomb. It stores enough kinetic energy to launch a bowling ball into orbit. To handle this, professionals use a tool called a spring compressor, a hardened steel clamp that bolts onto the spring to hold it safely in place. Derek, however, did not have a spring compressor. What he did have was a bag of heavy-duty plastic zip ties he bought in a bulk pack of 500. In Derek's mind, quantity was a quality all its own. If one zip tie can hold a bundle of Ethernet cables, surely 50 of them could hold back the crushing force of a 2-ton vehicle's suspension. He removed the strut assembly from the car and, using the weight of the vehicle to compress the spring, he began his artwork. He wrapped zip tie after zip tie around the coils, chaining them together, creating a web of white plastic that looked like a spider on meth had attacked his shock absorber. He stepped back, admired his handiwork, and muttered the famous last words of the suburban engineer. "That ain't going nowhere." He then placed the strut on his workbench and began to loosen the top nut that held the whole assembly together. As he turned the wrench, the load transferred from the steel mount to the plastic ties. The plastic began to stretch. They turned a sickly, stressed white color. They made a sound like zzz-zzz-zip, a high-pitched whine of polymers screaming in agony. Derek, focused on the nut, ignored the screams. He ignored the fact that he was essentially dismantling a loaded cannon while looking down the barrel. He spun the nut off. For a fraction of a second, the plastic held. Then, the first zip tie snapped. This caused a shock wave that instantly snapped the second, the third, and the 50th. It was a cascade failure of catastrophic proportions. The coil spring, suddenly liberated from its plastic prison, expanded from 12 inches to 20 inches in less than a blink of an eye. The heavy steel top plate of the strut, which was no longer bolted down, rode that wave of energy like a surfer on a tsunami of steel. It launched upward with enough force to punch through a brick wall. Unfortunately, Derek's face was in the way. The impact was instantaneous and absolute, turning a routine maintenance job into a closed-casket funeral. Derek proved that while duct tape and zip ties can fix many things, they cannot fix a fundamental lack of respect for stored mechanical energy. 6. The modern automobile is a marvel of safety engineering, packed with airbags, crumple zones, and sensors designed to keep the occupant alive during the most horrific collisions. But no amount of engineering can protect a driver from a decision as profoundly stupid as the one made by Travis. Travis was cruising down the interstate on a hot summer afternoon, enjoying the freedom of the open road and a distinct lack of hydration. He reached into his passenger seat cooler and pulled out a refreshing glass-bottled Mexican soda. It was cold, it was sugary, and it was sealed with a non-twist-off cap. Travis realized his mistake immediately. He had no bottle opener. Most people would wait until the next rest stop. Some might try to use the edge of the dashboard. Travis, however, looked down at his chest and saw a piece of metal that looked suspiciously like a lever. It was the tongue of his seatbelt. In a flash of what he surely thought was brilliance, Travis decided to improvise. But the seatbelt tongue was currently occupied. It was locked into the buckle, saving his life. Just for a second, he likely reasoned, a phrase that appears on the tombstone of thousands of Darwin Award winners. Doing 70 miles per hour in the passing lane, Travis clicked the release button. The belt retracted, leaving him completely unsecured in a 2-ton metal box, moving at hurricane speeds. He grabbed the metal tongue and tried to wedge it under the bottle cap. It was a fiddly operation. The geometry wasn't quite right. To get better leverage, Travis took both hands off the wheel, one holding the bottle, one holding the belt, and looked down to line up the makeshift tool. For 3 seconds, he wasn't driving a car. He was a bartender in a moving cockpit. He finally got the edge under the cap and yanked upward. Success. The cap popped off. But in that moment of triumph, the fizzy soda erupted, foaming over his hands and lap. Startled by the cold, sticky explosion, Travis jerked his knee, which bumped the steering wheel hard to the right. The car, now a rudderless ship, swerved violently toward the concrete median. Travis instinctively slammed on the brakes, But without a seatbelt to lock him in place, the laws of motion took over. The car hit the barrier and stopped. Travis did not. He continued traveling at 70 miles per hour, launching out of his seat, through the windshield, and into the afternoon sky like a human cannonball. He landed 100 feet down the road, his thirst permanently unquenched. The ironic cherry on top of this tragic Sunday? The glass bottle of soda was found intact in the passenger footwell, still half full, having survived the crash that its opener did not. Travis had turned the single most important safety device in his vehicle into a tool for his own destruction, proving that while seatbelts save lives, they only work if you keep them buckled. 7. In the annals of home improvement history, laziness is often the mother of invention. But in the tragic case of Wyatt and his backyard shed, laziness was the father of a closed-casket funeral. Wyatt was a man who operated on a strict energy conservation budget. If a task required walking more than 50 feet, he considered it a violation of his human rights. On a humid Saturday afternoon, he was engaged in the noble battle of fixing a loose siding board on his tool shed. He had the board, he had the nail, and he had the will to finish the job so he could go back to drinking beer. The only thing he didn't have was his hammer, which was sitting on a workbench in the garage, a grueling, insurmountable distance of approximately 35 feet away. To a normal person, this is a minor inconvenience. To Wyatt, this was a logistical nightmare that required a creative solution. He looked down at his hip, where he proudly open-carried his beloved .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol, because in his mind, you never knew when a squirrel might try to organize a coup. A synapse in his brain, presumably one that had been starved of oxygen since the mid-90s, fired a connection that defied all logic. Metal is hard. Hammers are metal. Gun is metal. Therefore, gun is hammer. It was a syllogism of pure, unadulterated stupidity. He drew the weapon, a loaded, chambered, lethal instrument designed by engineers to project lead at supersonic speeds, and flipped it around to grip the barrel. Now, gun manufacturers spend millions of dollars designing safety mechanisms, drop safeties, and trigger guards, but they generally don't stress test their precision instruments against being used as a blunt force impact tool for carpentry. Wyatt lined up the nail with the butt of the grip, a polymer and steel surface that housed the mainspring and the magazine. He took a swing. The first hit drove the nail in a fraction of an inch. Emboldened by this success and feeling like a genius of efficiency, he wound up for a harder, more decisive strike, treating his tactical sidearm like it was a $5 mallet from a bargain bin. Here is the thing about Newtonian physics and inertia that Wyatt was about to learn the hard way. When you slam a gun, butt first, into a solid wall, the frame stops instantly, but the internal parts, like the heavy metal slide, the trigger group, and the sear, want to keep moving forward. As he brought the weapon down with a violent percussive thud against the nailhead, the sheer kinetic shock jarred the internal mechanism. The inertia was enough to trip the sear, or, perhaps more likely, his finger flailing in the awkward reverse grip slipped inside the trigger guard. The mechanics don't matter as much as the result. The gun did exactly what it was built to do. It fired. Because the barrel was being held in his hand and pointed directly back at its owner's midsection, the round didn't have to travel far. The .45 caliber slug entered his abdomen at point-blank range, instantly ending his career as a handyman and his tenure on Earth. Wyatt collapsed against the shed, defeated by a single nail that was still sticking out by half an inch, proving that while the pen is mightier than the sword, a hammer is definitely, absolutely, 100% mightier than a Glock when it comes to basic construction work. 8. We have all been there. You walk into a room, the door clicks shut behind you, and the handle spins uselessly in your hand because the internal latch has disintegrated from old age. Most people would bang on the door, call for help, or perhaps kick the door down. But Brendan was not most people. He was a man who had watched far too many action movies and believed that he possessed an innate, MacGyver-like ability to improvise tactical solutions in high-pressure environments. Trapped in his second-story bedroom with his phone downstairs, Brendan decided that waiting for his roommate to come home was for quitters. He looked at the window. It was a 20-foot drop to the concrete patio below, too far to jump without breaking a leg, but perfect for a dramatic Special Forces-style rappel. He needed a rope. He scanned the room, bypassing the bed sheets, which actually would have worked, and his eyes landed on the coaxial cable running from the wall to his television. To Brendan, this thick black cord looked just like the high-tensile wire used by spies in movies to descend elevator shafts or swing between skyscrapers. In reality, a coaxial cable is a delicate sandwich of copper foam, thin aluminum foil, and plastic shielding designed to carry episodes of Seinfeld, not the dynamic load of a 200-pound adult male. Ignorance, however, is bliss, right up until the moment it becomes gravity. Brendan ripped the cable from the wall, giving himself about 15 feet of length. He tied one end to the cast iron radiator, a solid anchor that gave him a dangerously false sense of security. He tied the other end around his waist with a knot that probably wouldn't have passed a Boy Scout inspection, presumably feeling like a rugged mountaineer conquering Everest. He opened the window and climbed onto the sill, preparing for his descent. The plan was to lower himself down hand under hand, suave and controlled. He grabbed the cable, leaned back, and committed his entire body weight to the void. For one glorious millisecond, he felt like a tactical genius. Then, physics filed a formal complaint. Copper has very low tensile strength. It stretches, and then it snaps. As soon as Brendan's full weight hit the line, the cable didn't just break, it shredded. The copper core snapped instantly, and the plastic sheathing followed suit like wet tissue paper. There was no slow descent, no dramatic pause, just a sudden, terrifying acceleration of 9.8 meters per second squared. Brendan plummeted 20 feet, landing flat on his back on the unforgiving patio stones with a sickening thud that signaled the end of his stunt career. He was found hours later by his roommate, tangles of TV cables still wrapped around his waist like a sad, low-budget bungee cord. The tragic irony that really seals the deal? The bedroom door was made of hollow core particle board. He could have punched his way out of the room with less effort than it took to set up his fatal, high-definition descent. 9. In the agricultural world, there is a legendary trick known to every old-school farmer for seating a tubeless tire that has popped off the rim. It involves spraying a little bit of starting fluid, ether, into the tire and tossing in a match. The resulting whoomp of the explosion rapidly expands the air, popping the tire beads back onto the rim. It is a dangerous, violent, and effective method when done with restraint and experience. But restraint was not a concept that Farmer Joe understood. Joe subscribed to the philosophy that if a little bit is good, a whole lot must be a guarantee. Joe was staring at a massive, flat tractor rear tire lying horizontally on the ground. He had been trying to seat the bead for an hour with an air compressor, but the gap was too big. Frustrated, sweating, and lacking patience, he grabbed a can of starting fluid. The rule of thumb suggests a quick 2-second spray is enough to do the job. Joe, however, decided to empty nearly the entire can into the tire cavity. He created a pool of highly volatile, explosive liquid inside the rubber donut, essentially turning his tractor wheel into a circular claymore mine. He let it sit for a moment, allowing the fumes to mix nicely with the oxygen, creating a stoichiometric mixture of doom. He stood over the tire, lit a match, and tossed it in. Now, we need to discuss the physics of a tire explosion on the ground. When the gas ignites, it expands in all directions with incredible velocity. The force pushing down hits the solid earth and has nowhere to go. The force pushing out hits the heavy rubber tread. The path of least resistance is up. The explosion was not a whoomp, it was a thunderclap that shook the birds out of the trees 3 miles away. The sudden, massive overpressure didn't just seat the bead, it launched the heavy steel rim off the ground while the rubber tire was momentarily compressed against the dirt. The rim, weighing over 100 pounds, became a cannonball fired from a mortar. Joe, who was leaning over the tire to watch his handiwork, took the full force of the rising steel assembly directly to the face. It launched him backward with such violence that his boots reportedly stayed in the dirt for a split second before following him. He had successfully seated the tire. In fact, the bead was locked on tighter than it had ever been. But he had also launched his own skull into low Earth orbit, proving that when you turn a wheel into a combustion chamber, you really don't want to be looking down the barrel. 10. Painting a long, high-security gate is a tedious job. It involves climbing up a ladder, painting a 4-foot section, climbing down, moving the ladder 4 feet, and repeating the process until you die of boredom. Greg, a man who prided himself on efficiency hacks that usually involved duct tape and hope, decided that this climbing down part was for suckers. He owned a pickup truck, and he owned an A-frame aluminum ladder. In his mind, combining them created a mobile assault painting platform that would revolutionize the home improvement industry. He set the 6-foot ladder up in the bed of his Ford F-150. He didn't strap it down, because straps take time, and Greg was all about speed. He climbed to the very top step, the one with the sticker that explicitly says, "Do not stand here," in big bold letters, and shouted to his wife in the driver's seat, "Okay, honey, just creep it forward real slow." The plan seemed brilliant on paper. As the truck rolled along at a walking pace, Greg felt like a king surveying his kingdom, brush in hand, covering ground at record speed. But Greg had forgotten about a little thing called mechanical leverage and the center of gravity. A 6-foot ladder standing in a truck bed effectively amplifies every single motion of the vehicle. A 1-inch bump at the tires translates to a violent 2-foot sway at the top of the ladder. As his wife gently rolled the truck forward, the rear tire dipped into a pothole no deeper than a soup bowl. To the truck, it was nothing. To the ladder, it was a catastrophic seismic event. The truck rocked slightly to the left. The top of the ladder, where Greg was perched like a precarious gargoyle, swung violently in a wide arc. Because he wasn't strapped in and the ladder wasn't strapped down, the laws of inertia took over with a vengeance. The ladder kicked out from under him, and Greg was launched from his mobile perch like a stone from a medieval catapult. He flew over the side of the truck bed, cleared the fence he was painting, and landed headfirst on the concrete curb on the other side. His wife, feeling a slight bump but hearing nothing over the radio, drove another 20 feet before realizing her husband had been unintentionally unloaded. Greg had turned a boring afternoon chore into a fatal gymnastics routine, proving that while time is money, saving 5 minutes isn't worth spending eternity in a box. We've just witnessed 10 PhDs in self-destruction, but I need a jury verdict. Who takes the gold medal for absolute brain rot today? Is it the guy who hammered a nail with a loaded .45, or the genius who turned his dishwasher into a napalm bomb? Fight it out in the comments. I want to see who you think deserves the crown. Subscribe if you own a real hammer, and I'll see you in the next one.